of the most fundamental insights of the Thomistic and Aristotelian worldview is that if morality is anything meaningful at all, if there are any such things as moral duties, obligations, norms, or values, it must be true that we human beings, at least at times, have the power to choose freely what actions we perform. No one is held morally responsible in matters over which he had no choice, and any moral praise, blame, condemnation, reward, or punishment would just be meaningless without the presupposition that the person in question could have acted otherwise than the way he acted. In other words, that he had a choice in the matter, and that choice was, in some important sense, free. Those who believe in the reality of free choice are oftentimes called libertarians. This has nothing to do with the political philosophy that defends the values of limited government and individual political freedom, also called libertarianism. Rather, to be a libertarian in the philosophical sense is simply to hold the view that free choice among humans is real, that humans really do freely choose their actions, and that the experience of free choice is not just illusory. The opposite view, the view that we do not have free choice, is known as determinism. The reason for this term is that if no actions are freely chosen, then the actions we may have thought were chosen are actually determined one way or another. If there's no such thing as free choice, we have no choice but to do the things we do, and our actions are thus determined to be what they are, hence the term determinism. There is also a third view, which has grown in popularity in recent decades. According to it, despite initial appearances, determinism is actually not inconsistent with freedom of choice, or what follows upon it, the fact that human beings are morally responsible for their actions. Since the fundamental claim of this view is that human freedom and determinism are actually compatible with one another, it has just come to be known as compatibilism. Why would someone conclude that all human actions are determined? Most often, this is due to the fact that one also believes in the doctrine of materialism, a view we considered back in Lecture 5. If all things in the natural world, including human beings, are purely material, then their actions and behaviors must be determined by the laws of nature, or the materialistic laws of biology, chemistry, and, at the most fundamental level, physics. But as we also saw in Lecture 5, we have good reasons to conclude that materialism is false. The best of which is the fact that it makes nonsense out of our ability to think about anything, or to have true or even false beliefs. It may be helpful to recount the following words from Lecture 5. If the thoughts and beliefs in our minds are, in fact, nothing more than arrangements of neurons, or some more basic elementary parts of neurons, it makes no sense whatsoever to say that our beliefs are true or false. Just as weight and color don't apply to things like numbers or geometrical figures, truth and falsity simply don't apply to arrangements of neurons. It makes no sense to say that one person's arrangement of neurons is true and another's is false. If, however, the beliefs located in one's brain are nothing other than arrangements of neurons, as the materialist holds, it follows that, on materialism, there really can be no such thing as a true or false belief. And yet consistency demands that the materialist would have to apply this to his own belief in materialism. And so it follows that if materialism is true, then it can't be true, because no belief or set of beliefs can be true. Once we begin to think through its implications, therefore, materialism quickly descends into incoherence. To see that materialism cannot be true is to see that most people's primary reason for accepting determinism is also baseless. Of course, someone might believe in determinism for other reasons, that is, without being a materialist, and we'll consider one of those reasons at the end of this lecture. But it's useful to consider for now the close connection between materialism and determinism. And this is because, for Thomas Aquinas, human beings have freedom of choice precisely because they are rational beings. Freedom of choice, in other words, flows from our rationality, which is why human beings, as the only rational animals, are also the only animals that can be held morally responsible for their actions. So the primary difference between materialism and the view of Thomas Aquinas is that Aquinas believes that each human being possesses a human soul, which is the formal cause of the human body. As we should recall from Lecture 5, the human soul possesses 3 sets of powers or faculties. At the most basic level, the human soul possesses vegetative powers, which includes the powers of metabolizing food, the nutritive power, growth, and reproduction. Above the vegetative powers of the soul, there is what Aquinas and Aristotle call the soul's sensitive powers, which we share in common with many other animals. Now, in Lecture 5, we mentioned as examples of the sensitive powers the 5 senses of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight, as well as the interior senses like imagination and memory. As Aquinas would observe, though, these are all examples of what he calls the cognitive sensitive powers. This means that the exterior and interior senses are all ways in which we apprehend the world around us. Experience shows, however, that the sensitive powers of the soul also include what Aquinas calls appetite. So it's one thing for us to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch things in the world around us, but it's another for us to feel an attraction or a repulsion from those things that we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Again, like the senses themselves, we share this sensitive appetite with many other animals, who also are powerfully affected by natural instincts and experience things like desire, fear, and anger. This is the context in which to understand the human will. Just as there exists, among the sensitive powers of our souls, a distinction between apprehension and appetite, there also exists this distinction among the rational powers of our soul. In Lecture 5, we discussed the soul's apprehensive rational powers, which includes simple apprehension, judgment, and reasoning, which are all what Thomas Aquinas argues are intellectual powers of the human soul. But just as the human soul has sensitive desires, it also has rational desires, a rational appetite. And this is precisely how Thomas Aquinas defines the human will. So it would be one thing for me to desire a second helping at the dinner table as a sensitive desire, but I may reason that a second helping would not be good for me, or something that I should not do in polite company. And so, when I refrain from taking that second helping, I do so by a power of the soul higher than and independent from my sensitive desires. So it wouldn't be accurate to say that I overcame my desires. In fact, I consented to my rational desire in spite of my sensitive desire, to do what I reasoned was good and right at a particular time. With the crucial distinction between the sense appetite and the rational appetite in mind, we are given to understand all the more the following analysis that Thomas Aquinas gives of a human action. Quote, "Of actions done by man, those alone are properly called human, which are proper to man as man. Now man differs from irrational animals in this, that he is master of his actions. Wherefore, those actions alone are properly called human, of which man is master. Now, man is master of his actions through his reason and will, whence, too, the free will is defined as, quote, the faculty of will and reason. Therefore, those actions are properly called human, which proceed from a deliberate will. And if any other actions are found in man, they may be called actions of a man, but not properly human actions, since they are not proper to man as man." End of quote. So, because human beings possess a rational appetite over and above their sensitive appetites, we are able to choose freely in such a way that our actions are rightly imputed to us, and we are morally responsible for them. Now, somebody might argue, don't other animals make choices as well? Consider a deer in the forest. Pursuing food, a deer may be running in one direction, but sensing danger, perhaps the smell of a predator, this same deer may stop and run back in the direction from where it came. Did not the deer, one might argue, make a choice? Did not the deer stop, weigh its options, and choose the path of avoiding danger rather than pursuing food? Thomas Aquinas would argue that, at least on the evidence, this is not what's going on. In fact, everything the deer does in this scenario can be explained at the level of sensitive, not rational appetite. In pursuing food, the deer is being driven by a natural instinct, its hunger. When it smells or sees a predator, it experiences another natural instinct, namely fear. For a moment, these two conflicting instincts pull the deer in opposite directions, and eventually the stronger instinct wins out, and the deer flees. There's no reason to believe that, standing there in the forest, the deer was doing anything like what we do when we deliberate, when we reason as to what will be the better option, and then choose one action over another on the basis of that reasoning. A human being can choose freely because he or she can desire things that he or she judges to be good or right. And this faculty of choice, although something influenced by the sensitive appetite, is able to operate independently of it. This is the way in which the rational man or woman who chooses is free, and the deer who simply follows its strongest instinct is not. True, the deer, in succumbing to the stronger instinct, makes a judgment in a certain sense because it follows the apprehension of its sense experience. But it does not judge as a rational human person can judge. Hence, Aquinas sums up the good reasons that we have to accept the reality of free choice as follows. Quote, "Man has free will. Otherwise, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. In order to make this evident, we must observe that some things act without judgment, as a stone moves downwards, and in like manner all things which lack knowledge. And some act from judgment, but not a free judgment, as brute animals. For the sheep, seeing the wolf, judges it a thing to be shunned, from a natural and not a free judgment, because it judges not from reason, but from natural instinct. And the same thing is to be said of any judgment of brute animals. But man acts from judgment because by his apprehensive power, he judges that something should be avoided or sought. But because this judgment, in the case of some particular act, is not from a natural instinct, but from some act of comparison in the reason. Therefore, he acts from a free judgment and retains the power of being inclined to various things. For reason, in contingent matters, may follow opposite courses, as we see in dialectic syllogisms and rhetorical arguments. Now, particular operations are contingent, and therefore in such matters the judgment of reason may follow opposite courses, and is not determinate to one. And forasmuch as man is rational, it is necessary that man have a free will. End of quote. Given that free will is real and not just illusory, as the determinist mistakenly believes, there are some important observations that we can derive, just a few of which we will explore here. For one thing, Aquinas states that, in principle, the fact that the will is free means that it is impossible to do violence to the human will. By this, Aquinas means that no one can be forced or coerced to will something precisely on account of the will's freedom. Now, of course, someone might, in some sense, be forced to do something against one's will. Someone much bigger and stronger than me, for example, might grab my arm and force me to strike someone. But if we think this through, an act of compulsion like that, though it succeeds in forcibly moving my arm, does not succeed in forcibly moving my will. In fact, as Aquinas rightly recognizes, the entire notion of forcing the will is self-contradictory, since the moment the will would be forced to do anything is the same moment that what it's forced to do ceases to be voluntary. Even the devil himself, with all of his powers of suggestion and persuasion, cannot force us to will something. In fact, Aquinas says that not even God can force the will to do something. And again, this is because of the self-contradictory nature of forcing someone to do something freely, that is to say, voluntarily. So, God cannot force us to will something any more than he can draw a square circle or create a tree that at one and the same time is taller than itself. To be sure, however, human beings do not will and act in a vacuum. Many things, while they cannot force us to will one thing or another, are able to influence our wills. Aquinas mentions several examples. Perhaps the obvious are passions like fear and concupiscence. So if I'm afraid, I may do something that I wouldn't have otherwise done. Likewise, fear may cause me not to do something that I otherwise would have done. Likewise, a person's hunger, thirst, or sexual desire may cause him to overeat or to commit adultery. In the case of adultery, the will is influenced by sexual desire. But this does not mean that committing adultery in this case should be considered involuntary. If so, the adulterer would not even be morally responsible for his actions. Rather, what may happen is that the will voluntarily succumbs to the influence of concupiscible desire, an influence, nevertheless, that the voluntary agent could have refused. An even more complex case is the way in which ignorance may influence the will. Remember that the will is defined by Aquinas as the rational appetite. So what we desire by the will is always what reason presents to it as something good or choice-worthy. But this, of course, does not mean that reason is always right. Sometimes our reason is in grave error. And interestingly, Aquinas states that this error itself is often something voluntary, for which we are morally responsible. So it may happen that I may wish to remain ignorant about something just so as to have an excuse to sin. Aquinas calls this affected ignorance. For example, I may not be 100% sure that the trees into which I'm shooting have people in them, and so instead of checking, I just go ahead and start shooting. It may be that I wouldn't do this if I knew that there were people in the woods, but I chose not to check so that I had an excuse to end their lives on the chance that they were. This not knowing may happen, says Aquinas, by conscious choice or simply by negligence. And as you might imagine, it doesn't get us off the hook. If anything, it only lessens our moral culpability. We would be even less exonerated if our ignorance was about a matter of moral principle. So it would be one thing to claim that I didn't know there were people in the trees into which I was shooting, but quite another to claim that, even though I did know there were people, that I just didn't know it was wrong to kill them. That would be something I'm morally bound to know, that I have no good excuse for not knowing. In the end, the only kind of ignorance that excuses us altogether is when we don't know some relevant fact that alters our course of action even after we do our due diligence. Aquinas' example is strikingly similar to the one I've been using. As he says, quote, "A man, after taking proper precaution, may not know that someone is coming along the road, so that he shoots an arrow and slays the passer-by." End of quote. Of all the different forms of ignorance, this kind alone causes involuntariness just without qualification. So these are the senses in which the human will is free, and by which human beings are morally responsible for their actions, even if that responsibility is mitigated at times by various factors. Determinists, Aquinas would argue, do not fully appreciate the degree to which the human will stands above and can act independently from the irrational and physical forces that influence but cannot solely determine our actions. Some determinists, however, take another approach. Rather than arguing that our actions are determined from below, so to speak, they would argue that our actions are determined from above. In fact, by God. What I'm talking about, of course, is the very old paradox of free will and divine omniscience, or more specifically, divine foreknowledge. It goes something like this. If God knows everything, then he knows everything that will happen in the future. He knows, for example, whether or not I will report all my income on my tax return next year. Let's say then that God knows with infallible knowledge that I will report all of my income next year. If that knowledge is truly infallible, then it seems that, when next year rolls around, I cannot help but to report all of my income. But if I cannot help but to report all of my income, then it seems that I do not do so freely. Likewise, if God knows that I will not report all of my income, then for the same reasons, it seems that I do not act freely in that event either. And if I do not act freely, then I'm not morally responsible for this action, nor am I morally responsible for any actions. As the argument goes, therefore, God's perfect knowledge of the future is logically incompatible with free choice. Thomas Aquinas was, of course, not the first one to tackle this problem, and so his solution to it naturally follows those of great philosophers and theologians that came before him, like Boethius and St. Augustine. According to all these great thinkers, there is in the end no real contradiction between free choice and God's foreknowledge, for the simple reason that God's knowing in advance of what we will freely choose does not take away from the fact that we do indeed choose it freely. Augustine put it this way, quote, "Thus it turns out both that we do not deny that God has foreknowledge of everything that will be, and nevertheless, that we do will what we will. For although he has foreknowledge of our will, it is the will of which he has foreknowledge. Therefore, it is going to be our will, since he has foreknowledge of our will. Nor could it be our will if it were not in our power. Therefore, he has foreknowledge of our power. Hence, power is not taken away from me due to his foreknowledge, It is thus mine all the more certainly, since he whose foreknowledge does not err foreknew that it would be mine. End of quote. To put the matter in slightly different terms, to see that there's no contradiction between God's foreknowledge and free choice, one must make the simple distinction between the fact that God knows what we will do and the false proposition that he forces, causes, or coerces us to do it. As Aquinas would add to this, however, we must also consider the fact that it's only true to say that God knows the future from our own human perspective. As we learned in Lecture 8, God is eternal, meaning that he is outside of time. As difficult as it is for our temporal minds to imagine, therefore, what are for us future events are simply absorbed into God's eternal knowledge. Thomas Aquinas' description of this is very terse, but it's well worth reflecting on. As he explains, quote, "Now God knows all contingent things, not only as they are in their causes, but also as each one of them is actually in itself. And although contingent things become actual successively, nevertheless, God knows contingent things not successively, as they are in their own being, as we do, but simultaneously. The reason is because his knowledge is measured by eternity, as is also his being. And eternity, being simultaneously whole, comprises all time, as was said above. Hence, all things that are in time are present to God from eternity, not only because he has the types of things present within him, as some say, but because his glance is carried from eternity over all things as they are in their presentiality." End of quote. This solution to the problem of free will and divine foreknowledge is a perfect example of how good philosophy is capable of dispelling common objections against the Catholic worldview, and of how important it is to learn from great Catholic philosophers and theologians like Augustine and Aquinas. In the end, there really are no compelling arguments against the human will's freedom, and the moral responsibility that freedom places upon us.